Unit 731 developed increasingly effective methods for breeding enormous quantities of fleas. At first, the insects were simply produced using human hosts. Ishii's scientists housed a group of 10 prisoners in an isolated shed. The men were dressed in heavily padded clothes and seeded with fleas. The human incubators were expected to meet their daily production quota by harvesting 100 fleas. While 1,000 fleas might have been sufficient for research needs, this level of production could not meet the demands of an operational weapons system. So the Japanese devised a process that yielded a phenomenal stockpile of infected vectors. To start the production cycle, feral rats were caught and chloroformed, and boys were employed to pick fleas from the rodents. The insects were placed into test tubes that were then upended over the shaved bellies of anesthetized plague-infected rats. Once the fleas had fed and acquired bacteria, the insects were transferred to incubators stocked with uninfected rodents and fleas. This method allowed the continuous production of infected vectors. So great was the demand for rodents to fuel the furious rate of insect production that a 4-story granary was built to feed and house the rat colony. As each generation of fleas matured, semi-nude workers harvested and packaged the infected insects. Today we call them graduate students. By dressing in loincloths, that's not in the book, that was an aside. By dressing in loincloths, the men ensured that a flea landing on their bare skin could be detected and brushed off before it had a chance to bite. Major General Kawashimi Kiyoshi, a physician-in-chief of the medical service, described the scale of production. In the detachments, 2nd Division, there were specially equipped premises capable of housing approximately 4,500 incubators. 3 or 4 white mice were put through each incubator in the course of a month. These mice were held in the incubator by means of special attachment device. There was a nutritive medium and several kinds of fleas in the incubator. The incubation period lasted 3 to 4 months, in the course of which each incubator yielded about 10 grams of fleas. Thus, in 3 to 4 months, the detachment bred about 45 kilograms, that's nearly 100 pounds, of fleas suitable for infection with plague. Given Kawashimi's testimony and the fact that a kilogram of fleas consists of about 3 million individuals, at the peak of production, the Japanese could produce more than 500 million plague-infected fleas a year. Let's move to their use. By modifying aerial spraying equipment, the scientists found that aircraft could directly release clouds of fleas over enemy targets. This method was used at Chusien, where plague erupted a month after attack. The outbreak developed more slowly than hoped, but 21 people eventually died, and many times that number were afflicted. And such losses were sufficient for sabotage operations, but the High Command would want more bodies in a full-fledged attack. And in short order, Unit 731 delivered. The raid on Kuzhou demonstrated the potential of infected fleas to inflict serious and sustained damage. The attack in the fall of 1940 triggered an outbreak that continued for the next 6 years. The city was losing people after Japan had lost the war. Perhaps some of the death toll was a consequence of the populace being unfamiliar with plague. Their first experience with the disease, courtesy of Unit 731, cost 50,000 lives. Entomological warfare was proving to be wickedly effective, but Japan's finest scientists thought they could do better than relying on bloodthirsty parasites. Believing that technological cleverness could trump evolution, Ishii's staff devised a method for protecting and distributing pathogens without the assistance of vectors. They loaded up 3 planes with granules containing plague bacteria. On contact with water, these pearly white grains were designed to swell, rupture, and release their lethal payload. Millions of granules rained down over Qinghua in November 1940. And then the researchers waited and waited and waited. There were no reports of disease in the city. The microbiologists at Unit 731 grudgingly concluded, no fleas, no plague. The attacks escalated toward wholesale entomological warfare. For example, the stockpile at Hangzhou for an impending raid included 11 pounds of cholera bacilli, 150 pounds of typhus, probably infected lice, and 15 million plague-infected fleas. As Ishi's confidence grew, he began to allow his minions a greater role. Ishi entrusted Colonel Oto Kiyoshi with the raid on Changte. To ensure that his master would not be disappointed, the colonel used, well, a bit of overkill. Ota supervised more than 100 men in producing, loading, and releasing 100 million infected fleas. Within days, an 11-year-old girl had died of plague and the outbreak was underway. The disease swept through the city and into the surrounding villages. The first fever-racked season left 500 dead. Another 7,000 would succumb before the epidemic subsided. Over the next 2 years, Unit 731 would attack more than a dozen villages, towns, and cities, causing more than 100,000 casualties with bubonic plague. Now, what I do from here in the book is talk about the second weapon system that the Japanese developed. And it was a bomb that actually they called the maggot bomb. It didn't actually have maggots. It had the front part of the bomb contained houseflies. The back part of the bomb contained a slurry of cholera. They would bomb a city and then follow with these bombs, which would then rupture, splatter the flies with cholera, and the flies would carry the bacteria into the city. And there were 2 attacks with these maggot bombs that triggered regional epidemics in China. The result of maggot bombs dropped by the Japanese in China was a death of 410,000 Chinese via the epidemics. That's more Chinese killed by maggot bombs than were killed by atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, while the Japanese were busy spreading plague-infected fleas and cholera-coated flies, well, the Germans, they were cranking out Colorado potato beetles to drop over England. But you might wonder about the United States. How about the Americans? Were our hands clean? Well, I'd have to say that a reading of history shows that our entomological warfare R&D lagged behind that of the Axis powers, but I also have to say that what we lacked in productivity, we made up in Yankee ingenuity. And so let me tell you this little story here of the ways in which the Americans used flies in World War II to wage entomological warfare.